Welcome to creating a level playing field for collaboration. How can we make a difference together in equity and mutuality instead of inviting people to participate in a project they do not own? In this series, we discover what works by sharing stories of lived experience from a diversity of wise guests, organizers, participants, facilitators, researchers of participatory projects. By sharing examples and insights, we want to contribute to co-creating a world that works for all. In this episode, we meet Peggy Holman. Peggy is known worldwide for her work on whole system change, as an author of several books, such as the Change Handbook, and as a coordinator and facilitator and initiator of networks and projects. Welcome, Peggy, in the podcast series Creating a Level Playing Field for Collaboration. What attracted you in my invitation?
It's funny, I find there's some situations where it's the topic, and there are some situations where it's the person who makes the invitation. And of course, it's at its best when both of those things are true. And you're asking about this particular topic. I mean, the first yes was because you asked. And the second is it is something I truly do care about. And actually trying to decide among multiple stories is a bit of a challenge because it is something that I pay attention to.
Okay, so maybe you can tell something more from an example from your experience, how you pay attention to the level playing field or something that happened.
Um, I guess the way I would frame it with whomever I'm working with, there are two questions that I always work with when I'm starting. And, the first is, what's your purpose? What are we trying to accomplish here? And given that purpose, who needs to be involved? And I have always come at it from a whole system perspective. But interestingly, when I've talked about that through the years, I remember someone coming up to me during following a talk I'd done at a conference, very excited because they didn't typically hear people bring up diversity as an important aspect. And for me, looking at the question of who needs to be involved, it comes at it from a slightly different angle than level playing field. For me, that's a given in the design. As you know, most of the work that I do involves open space in some way. And because it's about creating a self-organizing space by its nature, uh, the essential core of that work is inviting people to take responsibility for what they love. And what I've learned over time is that's always an act of service. And so by the nature of how we organize, I think it lends itself to creating a level playing field.
Can you tell something what you mean with inviting the whole system?
You bet. Um, and actually, I'll tell you one of the stories to
Yes,
put that
please
in
do. Yeah.
context. So as you know, I have worked with journalists and journalism for 23 years. And even from the very beginning, our goal was to have the whole system of journalism participate. And in the early days, we thought of it as getting print, broadcast, and new media people in the room. But over the 23 years of doing 24 open space convenings around different aspects, um, one of the organizing questions has always been who needs to be in the room, given our focus and how we thought about the whole system of journalism evolved. So, as I mentioned, initially It was just journalists, but it was at that time remarkable to have print broadcast and digital journalists talking to each other. That was pretty unheard of. But we began to broaden it, and in those early years, we thought about it mostly functionally. So we brought in citizen activists and journalism educators and researchers and funders as nonprofit journalism started to take off, and even a Wall Street analyst for the, commercial journalists made their way into our convenings. And it took 8 years, but we were invited to do a convening at a place called the Poynter Institute. And Poynter is a kind of a mid-career gold standard for training journalists. And they invited us to do one of our Journalism That Matters unconference style open space convenings. And so to this place that's kind of in the heart of mainstream journalists, we brought community activists and bloggers and researchers and people who didn't typically show up at a Poynter Institute. And during that convening, two journalists, one a Black woman, the other a Latino man, approached me and said, "Your convenings are way too white." I looked around the room and we looked like a typical journalism gathering, which is 80 to 90% white. And I said, "You're right. Help us do it differently." So we got money together, got sponsorship, and we put together, as I do anytime I start convening one of these kinds of gatherings, an organizing reflective of who we aspire to have in the room. It was quite the learning experience because 3/4 of our group were people of color, journalists of color. I found myself in conversations as we were planning for this that I'd never been in before. One of the things that stays with me very clearly was this tension within the community of people who had experienced our convenings before. But there was a tension on the communities of color, journalists of color, over whether this is about getting a seat at the table, traditional journalism organizations, or if it's more about rolling our own, do it yourself, reimagining, reinventing.
Yeah.
And I just watched this tension play out as the organizing group was setting its theme and purpose. And it came together. It took longer than usual, frankly. But what we came to was a theme that everyone said yes to, which was create or die. And somehow landing on that theme had room for everyone in it. With that, we ran with it. Set a goal that 75% of the participants for Create or Die would be journalists of color. And we hit that goal, which meant that it was a conversation that nobody had because it was not just people of color. There were just enough white people in the room that everybody ended up, when we actually held this, having a different conversation than typically takes place.
Well, what was different in the conversation?
It's a few years ago, so there were a number of things. For example, there was one very senior guy from National Public Radio who had kind of given up on things like diversifying, well, how would I put it? He was dealing with, how do I educate my predominantly white organization to look more broadly at who they invite as guests, and left the room with a myriad of ideas that came from the mix of people who were in the room. We ended up having a group, 2 or 3 people who were investigative reporters who were white, and investigative reporting at that time was still pretty much a white bastion. And he suddenly found himself being questioned and coached by journalists of color who had been knocking on the door to do investigative journalism. And they were asking him about sources and coaching him on how he they broadened their availability for different kinds of sources. So again, it was the kind of conversation that wouldn't typically take place. But what happened there, and I'd seen this actually happen at the Pointer convening, where we had activists and investigative journalists coaching each other on how to talk, because there are often activists are always after journalists to cover their story, and journalists are always reluctant because they don't like being uh, used as a way for activists to get their story out. And so both groups ended up coaching each other on how to talk, journalists how to talk to activists, activists how to talk to journalists. That's one of the reasons, examples of reasons why having a diversity of people present makes such a huge difference and enables breakthroughs to take place. And so the kind of ethic of welcome the stranger, that is part of the fabric of doing open space, tends to create the kind of level playing field that you're talking about, because the signals right up front are, you're different. That's interesting. You bring a point of view I haven't heard before. Tell me more.
Okay.
And that um, that spirit of invitation and curiosity that infuses an open space, coupled with being really deliberate about getting the whole system into the room. I'm the rubric that I use. I give a nod in 2 directions. One is to Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff, who, in doing future search, always very consciously, deliberately aim for getting the whole system in the room. And they talk about wanting the people who are in, which is an acronym for, you want the people with authority, resources, expertise, information, and need. So from a functional point of view, when I start working with a group to organize, we do the thinking about who makes up those different kinds of roles. And one of the lessons that came out of that create or die open space comes from the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, which has been a mainstay of educating journalism and working with communities of color and bringing greater diversity present. And they, Maynard Institute, developed what they call the fault lines. And they identified different kinds of demographic diversity. So gender, geography, generation, race, class. They've recently added sexual orientation, and they have 2 what they call fissures that I think in the US at least have become full-grown fault lines, which are religion and political orientation. And then I have recently added disability. And not necessarily all of those forms of diversity are relevant in every situation, but asking the question of which of them are becomes part of the preparation that I do with a group to understand who makes up the system.
Okay, I have a question. In the example the story you told us, you succeeded to get 75% of colored people in. How did you manage that? How did you invite them?
And it goes to putting together an organizing group that is reflective of the people you aspire to have present.
Okay.
And so it often goes through at least two iterations, because as you get clearer about your question and realize who isn't present that you want to invite, we'll look for somebody who has contacts, a network, to become part of the organizing. So an awful lot of the outreach work happens by involving people from the communities that you wish to reach in the group. And remember, I said 3/4 of the people of our organizing for that event were people of color. And so they reached out to their networks, and that was how we made it happen.
Yeah, I can imagine that by simply looking around in the room, people respond, okay, this looks another image than we are used to. And you said, okay, it brought some tension. How was that tension released?
I fall back on one of the very basic dialogic approaches that I first learned, which is circle process. And I find the combination of silence when things get really hot. So let's take some breath here and do some listening to what's going on inside myself, followed by a check in circle of inviting people to speak without being interrupted, of what's true for them, doing a circle and then moving into a free flow virtually always breaks through the tension.
Okay.
So it's a practice of deep listening.
Yeah. To start with a check-in circle?
Yes.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, it is typically the way I start any kind of organizing practice. And the first time folks come together, it's a question that we check in around of what's the inspiration? What was the yes for you in showing up here? What is the possibility that you see in investing the time and energy and making this happen? And it's in that first expression of of the yes, what has heart and meaning, what excites you about doing this, however we end up phrasing it for this particular culture that we're working with. It's in people listening to each other, and because they all have a different facet of it, that we generally land in an organizing question.
So it matters who is present, who shows up, who's in the room. You start with diversity as part of the level playing field, but also the attitude of the facilitator to give part of that field to everybody. So
Yes.
everyone in the room owns part of the responsibility.
Yep. 100%. And it's funny when it takes me to a story of when we first formed the Open Space Institute of
Yes,
the
please do.
US,
Yeah.
which was in like 1996, something like that. And these kinds of dialogue processes were all new to me, so it was all an experiment. And I would come to our organizing meetings with an agenda that I had in my hip pocket just because those were the things I wanted to make sure got covered. But we would start with a check in circle about what's important to you to make sure we handle today. And the lesson out of that was that not only did everything on my list always get covered, but things I hadn't thought of would also come up and get covered. And equally as important, rather than it being drudgery, people had a good time. And so the meetings also deepened our relationships and appreciation of each other, because there's something about that quality and give and take and shared responsibility for what we were creating that just totally changed the vibe.
So, and how did that impact what happened after the meeting?
Uh, People took responsibility
Yeah.
to follow through, that they owned it, and we collectively owned it. And so the um, it didn't become me chasing people down to get stuff done. The expectation and my experience was they had a stake in it. They got done what they said they were going to do. And if for some reason they couldn't, they let people know so that somebody else could step in and help. That experience of, 30 years ago is now just, I trust the truth of that because it is my consistent experience over 30 years of supporting people and self-organizing around what matters to them.
Okay, thank you. And you also initiated a process called co-creating a world that works for all. That's where we reconnected. And
Yeah.
you also provided the cradle for the podcast series, because I got the opportunity to post the idea, okay, let's make a podcast series on how can we create a more level playing field in participatory processes. So thank you for that. Um, is there something you would like to say as a checkout?
Um, I'm looking at some of the notes. I think there are two things I want to mention. Um, One is the notion of belonging, because I think that creating a level playing field, which I believe open space structurally does, it becomes level when people feel they belong, and belong by being themselves rather than having to shut up and conform. So it is about creating places for people to show up authentically and contribute their gifts. Um, I think that's both a measure and an aspiration of just this whole way of working. And part of the way we do that, it's clarity of purpose, inviting the diversity of the system. And the third element for me is creating hospitable space. And I credit Juanita Brown, who's the creator of World Cafe, for raising that to visibility for me. And there are many different ways that we go about doing that, but it's creating that space where people feel welcome. Those felt like important elements to name that
Okay, thank you.
that I think contribute to a level playing field.
Uh, what I hear, the hospital space create people like human beings who want to connect and belong and
Yeah.
express themselves as they
Yep.
are,
Yep.
and not as someone else wishes them to be, or from a function or a role.
And so often we shut up because we fear we'll be excluded if we say what's really on our mind. And so to create a place where the polite thing to do is to bring your whole quirky self and speak your mind, I think is one of the greatest gifts that I've learned in working with open space for 30 years.
Okay, so thank you, Peggy Holman, for being in this podcast series. I feel very grateful that you shared your long time wisdom, your experience.
And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening. A new episode will be posted every 2 weeks with new exciting stories on how to create a level playing field for collaboration. I hope you will be back. Together we can make a difference in the world.